Hello and welcome, where we listen, we relax, and we get sleepy. I'm your host, Thomas. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. We'll begin a dreamy retelling of the classic tale, Beauty and the Beast. It's a perfectly autumnal story to lead you into a good night's sleep. Let's just take a moment to settle in and let go of any unease lingering in the body or mind. Make yourself comfortable, and as you ease into stillness, just allow your breathing to draw out a little longer, particularly on the exhale. Focus your attention as much as you can on your breathing. Let the slow, steady rhythm of the airflow become a mindful and soothing experience. When I speak to you here, prior to each story, I try to say the things that I know I would want to hear if I were falling asleep to this show. I've found the process of getting to sleep, in particular, rather difficult throughout much of my life. I still have bad patches nowadays, but I've gradually learned to remain calm and not let it stress me out on those difficult nights. Yes, it can make the next day a fair bit more challenging, but getting worked up about it only brings more wakefulness. So remember, while you listen along tonight, you can use your breath to help pacify any stress, tension, or worry. It's a simple yet effective way to calm the nervous system and guide you into a beautiful night's sleep. And that's especially true when you combine those deep breaths with a dreamy bedtime story like this one. It's a tale as old as time. So without further ado, drift into the fairy tale world of Beauty and the Beast. There was once a kindly gentleman named Malcolm who lived peacefully on a small estate with his daughter, Arabella. The child's mother had passed away when the girl was very little. So although the man held many lovely memories of his wife, Arabella knew her only through his stories. Ah, she was beautiful and intelligent, he would tell little Arabella. All the other fellows in town wished for her hand, and I was the lucky one who won her heart. The little girl loved hearing about her mother, because it made her feel as though she knew her, even though she had not been there to see Arabella grow up. The gentleman and his daughter lived in a rambling old stone house that was just grand enough to entertain a few visitors, but not so enormous as to be pretentious. Arabella loved the mansion, and its gardens in particular. She was extremely fond of a special part of the courtyard that had once been cared for by her mother. According to her father, his bride had loved nature deeply, and she had spent many hours selecting the trees and flowers that would fill her little paradise, making it ever more enchanting for the man she loved. Arabella's father had surprised her mother with a beautiful fountain, pretty stone benches, and an arbor. When his wife was not tending the garden, she could often be found reading there for hours on end. Arabella inherited that same love for the sweet little garden, and she took to spending time there whenever she wished to find a quiet place for reflection or simply to feel closer to her mother. It seemed to her that of all the places on the estate, her mother's garden had the most delicate flowers, the most refreshing breezes, and the most fascinating animal visitors. She felt most relaxed in that perfect spot, just watching the bees as they danced through the blooms, or the leaves as they drifted into the fountain. It was a perfect respite from the world. Their home was only a short distance from other respectable families, but they did not tend to go visiting or socializing without a lady of the house to organize such things. Malcolm found it a bit awkward to call on his neighbors as a result. Arabella therefore learned to entertain herself. She had a faithful little dog named Henry, who kept her laughing with his silly antics and offered her adoring companionship. With that, she was content. Yet, as much as Malcolm's love for his late wife endured, he did grow a bit lonely after many years of life as a widower. When Arabella was 15, he began spending time with a widow named Lydia, who lived nearby. She was a very respectable lady, handsome in a reserved sort of way, and she had 2 daughters named Agnes and Imogen. Agnes was 17, and Imogen was nearly the same age as Arabella, although they were properly educated in the skills expected of young ladies. Arabella did not find them to be particularly stimulating company. Where Arabella might wish to discuss books or horticulture, they preferred local gossip. Where she had thoughts to share about music, they preferred fashion. Arabella was polite to all of them for her father's sake, but she secretly found Agnes and Imogen a bit tedious. She reflected with disappointment that it was a shame they had so little in common, for she would have liked to have had some close friends. Under these circumstances, she made an effort to appear happy when her father brought her the news that he and Lydia were to marry. She and her father were very close, having had only each other for company all those years. Arabella, therefore, had mixed feelings about the match. On one hand, she genuinely wished for her father's happiness. On the other, it would be a new experience to share her home and her private world with 3 other women, none of whom seemed to have much in common with her. Nonetheless, Arabella smiled bravely for her father and congratulated him, wishing him joy. The wedding of a widow and a widower was generally a quiet affair in those days. The match was privately made, and the lady and her daughters were soon installed at Malcolm's house. Although there were empty bedrooms available, some shuffling of chambers was inevitable. Arabella found that she felt obligated to politely offer her own room, one of the largest in the house, to Agnes. At 17, her new stepsister was, after all, the eldest young lady. Rather than graciously thanking Arabella for the swap, Agnes seemed to think the larger room was her due. She unceremoniously moved in, spreading her things everywhere in a jumble. Arabella managed to tamp down her annoyance as the new occupant made a mess of her childhood retreat. Instead, she focused on making her smaller chamber a cozy getaway. While it was not the grandest space in the house, it had a charming window seat that overlooked her mother's garden, and the furnishings were pretty, having been chosen by her mother long ago. Meanwhile, Imogen moved into a similar room across the hall. Arabella caught glimpses through the open door and noted that she was as careless with her belongings as her sister. Dresses, shoes, and jewelry were simply piled about, and there was a notable absence of books. Imogen showed little interest in getting to know her new stepsister or in sharing any confidences with her. The two girls kept to themselves, Arabella in her tidy room with her neat array of clothing and books, and Imogen in her chaotic chamber, where she spent most of her time trying new hairstyles and fussing over her outfits. The addition of 3 demanding new ladies stretched Malcolm's resources. Arabella had grown up with a very small household staff. There was a kindly woman from the village who came each day to make dinner. And she had a daughter named Clara, a sweet and industrious girl. Clara served as a maid, helping with whatever household tasks needed doing. Since it had once been just the two of them living there, Malcolm and Arabella had enjoyed a friendly, easy relationship with both Clara and her mother, with no need for formality. As soon as the 3 new family members had settled in, however, they began to feel quite comfortable asserting themselves. They thought nothing of bothering Clara to bring their breakfast upstairs rather than appearing in the dining room. They dropped their personal items wherever they pleased and expected them to be magically returned to their rooms. They even diverted Clara from her usual duties to help with their clothes and hair, tasks they could easily have done themselves, but which they considered beneath them. They fancied themselves very grand indeed, and expected Clara to act as a lady's maid in addition to her usual work. Although Clara was hard-working, she was not trained in the art of hairstyling, nor was she an expert seamstress. Arabella tried to help quietly, lending a hand with difficult sewing or chores Clara could not manage alone. Before long, however, Lydia began complaining to Malcolm that her daughters needed a proper maid who could make them look their best. After all, Lydia insisted, they would soon be ready to find husbands. In truth, Malcolm did not understand the fuss. He and his daughter had managed perfectly well on their own. Arabella had never required a special lady's maid, and he had always thought she looked wonderful. Nonetheless, he wished to make his new bride happy. He promised her that he would make inquiries on his next business trip, hoping to bring an experienced maid from the city. This appeased Lydia to some extent, but she began badgering him to plan his next trip soon after. After all, she said petulantly, she could not be expected to continue depending on that girl from the village to keep the ladies of the house looking up to standard. It was very clear to Arabella if her father's announcement of a new business venture was due to his own ambitions or those of his wife. But Malcolm soon revealed to the family that he would be setting off on an overseas journey. A trusted friend had invited him to join in on a new investment, he told them over dinner. It was nearly certain to be very profitable, he assured them. However, he needed to travel to a far country in order to make the proper arrangements, and he expected to be gone for a couple of months. Arabella was quiet during the rest of the meal, as her stepmother and stepsisters showered Malcolm with requests for gifts and exotic goods that he might bring them. Lydia put on a somewhat unconvincing display of soundness at his leaving, though her obvious delight at the prospect of finally engaging a new maid eclipsed her poor show of regret. For her part, Arabella was dreading months of being cooped up with only her stepmother and stepsisters for company. Furthermore, she was worried about the running of the house. How would things be managed in his absence? After dinner, the two of them took a quiet turn together in her mother's garden. Malcolm held both of her hands in his and looked her directly in the eye. He told her that he knew she was prepared to take care of the estate while he was gone. He would be leaving ample funds to support them for even longer than he expected to be away. Although Lydia would officially be in charge of his affairs, during that time, he acknowledged that his new wife had little interest in official business. He was confident Arabella could keep the household running behind the scenes. Arabella was both flattered and nervous about the confidence he placed in her. It was true, she knew the house inside and out, and she was on excellent terms with their small staff. She had learned from Malcolm at an early age, following his lessons on money. Most importantly, she was a sensible girl and a quick study. Nonetheless, it felt like a heavy responsibility. The day of his departure came all too soon. As if in sympathy with his daughter's feelings, the early spring skies were dark and rainy. While a carriage waited, the women of the household stood on the front stairs holding up shawls to shelter from the rain. After a somewhat formal farewell, Lydia abruptly turned and went inside. Agnes and Imogen rushed after her with relief. Arabella, however, hugged her father close, clinging to him as if she could stop him from going. He patted her on the back, reassuring her that all would be well, and she bravely released him. Standing up straight, heedless of the soaking downpour, she smiled and told him not to worry. She would take care of everything until he returned. His face showed his love for her as he waved goodbye and climbed into the hired carriage. She watched it until it was no more than a small dot on the road. The tempestuous March and April days turned into a balmy summer. Occasionally, a letter would arrive from Malcolm, detailing his foreign travels. The going was hard at times, he reported, but he was also experiencing exotic places he had never expected to see. In June, as idyllic summer weather rested gently over the countryside, Malcolm sent a message to say his travels had been extended. He apologized greatly, but promised it would be worth the trouble. He enclosed funds to keep the household running for another 2 months. The new influx of money was a huge relief to Arabella, who had been nervously watching the last of the household budget disappear. To her consternation, however, Lydia seized upon the funds immediately, stating imperiously that Agnes and Imogen desperately needed new clothes. Although the family lived outside of town, there was still a social season to consider, and Agnes was ready to be presented in society. Arabella hesitated, but felt she must speak up. She politely suggested that there were some urgent household concerns that needed attention first. The servants had to be paid. The larder was growing alarmingly empty, and a man from the village was needed to tend to repairs. Would it not be wiser, she asked gently, to take care of those matters first? Lydia's reaction to her stepdaughter's boldness was swift and angry. She icily informed Arabella that she would spend her money as she saw fit, and that a 15-year-old girl would not instruct her on how to run a proper household. Furthermore, she suggested that if Arabella was so concerned about the cost of the staff, they should dismiss Clara altogether and let Arabella take over her duties. Agnes and Imogen dissolved into fits of laughter. "Why don't you start by cleaning the fireplace in my room?" Imogen said, with a spiteful edge to her voice. "What a good idea," Agnes responded haughtily. "I know. We could just call her Cinderella." Both sisters found this tremendously amusing and began speculating gleefully about what other jobs their Cinderella could do. Arabella left the room without another word. She rushed down the hall and retreated to her bedroom, with her faithful little dog, Henry, close on her heels. There, she threw herself into the window seat and leaned her head against the glass, staring out at her mother's garden. "How very unfair it all was," she whispered tearfully to Henry, who cocked his head sympathetically. "Why couldn't Mother still be here? Why did Father have to leave on such a long journey?" She stroked Henry's soft fur and watched twilight slowly fall outside. Eventually, she drifted into sleep. When Arabella awoke the next morning, the first thing she saw was Clara walking away from the house. Confused, she tapped on the window and asked where she was going. In truth, however, Arabella already knew the answer. Her heart sank as she realized Lydia had dismissed the maid, no doubt redirecting Clara's wages toward new clothes and other luxuries. Meanwhile, Henry was insistent about leaving the room. He whined at the door, wagging his tail madly, as Arabella splashed water on her face and tidied her hair. She opened the door just as Imogen emerged from her own room, fully dressed for the day. Her stepsister paused, appraising her. "Oh, look," Imogen sneered. "If it isn't Cinderella. Mother has sent Clara packing, so you have a few chores to take care of." With a smirk, she added, "You might want to change into something better, suited for hard work." She turned on her heel and flounced down the carpeted hall, her long curls bouncing defiantly as she descended the stairs, unsure what to do next. Arabella followed Henry down the opposite hall and descended the back stairs to the kitchen. Cook was there, beside herself. The kind woman feared losing her position, yet Lydia was demanding she handle both the cooking and all of Clara's former duties. Arabella embraced Cook, whom she had known all her life, and reassured her she would not be left to manage alone. Resolutely, she took Clara's apron from its hook and tied it around her waist. Then she asked where she should begin, and that was the day Arabella, the former favored daughter, the only lady of the house, became a servant to her stepmother and stepsisters. "Cinderella," they called out, "light my fire, wash my clothes, iron my petticoat." At first, Agnes and Imogen made these demands with slight hesitation, as if dimly aware of how wrong it was. But seeing that their mother behaved the same way, their cruelty quickly escalated. They did fewer and fewer things for themselves, deliberately overloading Cinderella with impossible work in order to humble her completely. Soon they referred to her only as Cinderella, as if her real name had faded from memory. In time, she heard their taunts echoing in her own mind, and she began to think of herself that way as well. The new version of herself bore little resemblance to the girl she once was. Yet, what else could she do? She had promised her father she would take care of the estate while he was away. His absence had stretched far beyond his last estimate, but she was certain he would return one day. How could she look him in the eye and say she had let the household fall into ruin because she did not wish to be a maid? No, that would not do. She had been raised with the belief that honoring one's responsibilities was a matter of personal integrity. She would not disappoint him. And so, she kept her promise, attending to the tiresome details of daily life. She scrubbed, she dusted, she polished the mirrors in which her stepsisters constantly reviewed their own reflections told a familiar story. The list of small responsibilities seemed to grow by the day, yet there was nobody else to complete them. Furthermore, she was afraid of what Lydia would do if she had to find the money to hire another maid. The coin that her father had sent months ago was long gone. Cinderella had noticed a few household objects vanishing: an antique clock, pieces of silver, a mirror, with a heavy gold frame. If Lydia was selling her father's treasures, how long would it take before she went after her mother's jewelry, for example, or pawned her father's treasured books? Cinderella toiled not to please Lydia and her stepsisters, but to hold together the home that she and her father had come to love. It was all she had left of her mother, all that is, except the beautiful garden. As the summer months rolled into autumn, and the hazy fall days chilled and turned to winter, Cinderella sought refuge in the garden in her few spare moments. Sitting on the bench near her mother's hazel tree, she watched the seasons go by, reveling in their quiet beauty. Her father had brought her mother the tree as a gift long ago. He told her that the Celts believed hazelnuts imparted wisdom and inspiration. This had delighted his bride, and she had always tended the tree with great care. Her daughter now watched it for her, enjoying its yellow catkins in the spring and observing the creatures who came to take advantage of its nuts in late summer. The scurrying squirrels and mice who pilfered its treasures made her smile. The months slipped by, turning to years, and Malcolm did not send word, nor did he return. Although Cinderella was resolved to keep her spirits up, she could not help but fear that he was lost to her forever, and that she was now trapped in a life of drudgery in her stepmother's household. For drudgery was truly the word to describe her life. The cook continued to manage the meals, but it seemed that everything else fell to Cinderella. Lydia continued to quietly sell items of value from various rooms of the house. The cook whispered that the woman was also running up a debt in town. Fortunately, Lydia did not know the whereabouts of the jewels Cinderella's mother had owned, because the girl had wisely hidden them long ago, carefully burying the box beneath her mother's hazel tree. Unburdened by the truth of their circumstances, Agnes and Imogen continued to buy whatever new clothes and jewels they could acquire. After dressing up, they would take the coach and visit fashionable people around the area, hoping to be invited to social events. Both of them were looking for husbands. Agnes was now 19 and Imogen 17. It was not just rumors that kept them from attracting suitors, though that was certainly a factor. They were also lacking in wit. Neither provided entertainment through clever conversation or musical talent. Sadly, Cinderella's stepsisters were the very definition of mediocrity. In the absence of a fortune, they posed few attractions to the eligible bachelors of the region. Cinderella was 17 as well, only a few weeks younger than Imogen. But there was no question of her going out into society. Not only was Lydia far too keen on showcasing her own daughters first, but Cinderella no longer had any decent clothes to wear. She was clever with her needle, but she was no magician, and she had received nothing new since being relegated to the role of scullery maid 2 years earlier. Once in a while, Agnes would toss one of her old gowns at Cinderella and sneer, "Here, I don't want this anymore." In those cases, the girl would alter the dress to fit her, making it suitable for everyday wear. But in general, she made do with clothes that looked shabbier with each passing month. Compounding Cinderella's problems, it did not escape Lydia's notice that despite her inferior clothing, her stepdaughter was luminous with youthful beauty. She had not had the advantage of dancing or deportment lessons considered essential for young ladies of society. Her lack of exposure to social events, even within her own family, left her without the affected flirtations of other eligible girls her age. Yet this only enhanced her charm. Lydia secretly fumed. No matter what she took from Cinderella or subjected her to, the girl retained a natural grace and unaffected manner that made her even more beautiful. The wretched woman resolved to keep her out of sight until her own daughters had found suitable matches. Finally, one autumn day, some news arrived that filled Lydia and her daughters with excitement. The king and queen were to spend the next few months at one of their country palaces nearby. This was an unusual turn of events. Although the royal family owned many fine houses throughout the country, many were rarely visited. Apparently, they were traveling through the kingdom because their oldest son was coming of age. Since he would one day be king, his parents intended to introduce him to his lands and the aristocrats who occupied them. Every mother of a debutante was filled with excitement, for it was well known that the handsome young prince was of an age to find a bride. When the royal family arrived, they were sure to throw a ball. This meant that every dressmaker for miles around would soon be extremely busy making finery for the daughters of the region's most established families. There was, however, one small problem for Lydia. There was simply no money left for clothes. Within an hour of hearing of the prince's visit, Lydia and her daughters were ransacking the house. Her desire to dress her daughters in finery overcame her last shred of decency. She threw open Cinderella's bedroom door, demanding to know what she and Malcolm had done with the missing valuables. Cinderella was honest to a fault, but this intrusion was too much. Lifting her chin with as much courage as she could muster, she quietly replied that she did not know what Lydia was talking about. She suggested that perhaps Malcolm had sold the jewels long ago or put them somewhere safe. Knowing the girl was probably not telling the truth, Lydia ordered her back to the kitchen. As Cinderella descended the back stairs, she smiled to herself. They would never find the jewels hidden safely in her mother's garden. Henry came trotting into the garden. The cook had let him out of the kitchen to find her. Cinderella smiled wistfully at Henry and whispered loving words to him. He wagged his tail eagerly and then sat down by her feet, content to be with her, despite the chill. As she stroked his fur, she realized that her eyes were watering. She missed her father so badly and was slowly losing hope that she would ever see him again. Worse yet, her life here had become a trying one. What prospects did she have now? Who would care for her with the cook and Henry as her only real friends? She did not feel that her future was very bright, and in the short term, her young heart was broken over missing the ball. Smiling through her tears, she said softly to Henry, "I don't suppose you can conjure up a dress for me? Something pretty and new?" Henry cocked his head to the side, as if he understood her. Then something odd happened. Henry started whining and looking at something behind her, over her shoulder. Before she could react, his face was bathed in a warm glow, and his whining turned into a happy bark. Twisting to see what had caught his attention, Cinderella laid eyes on the most amazing sight she had ever seen. Standing in front of the hazel tree was the shimmering outline of a woman. The apparition was neither old nor young, but somewhere in between. She wore a somewhat old-fashioned dress that Cinderella recognized as a style of years past. It was very elegant and floated around her in an ethereal mist. In fact, the lady herself almost seemed to levitate, as if she were not bound by the laws of gravity. A halo of light surrounded her, suffusing her with a sparkling warmth that filled her speechless onlooker with a deep sense of well-being. Henry had stopped barking and now sat expectantly, staring at the apparition. Cinderella, meanwhile, was tongue-tied. What could one possibly say to a gorgeous vision appearing spontaneously in the garden? Luckily, the presence spoke first. "My child," she said gently, "you are troubled. You do not need to tell me why. I have seen everything." Freed from the obligation to speak, Cinderella waited to see what the lady would do next. "Your stepmother and stepsisters have been very unkind to you," the apparition continued, "and you have behaved admirably. You have borne a heavy weight in your young heart. Although you did not know it, I have always watched over you. My presence is here with the hazel tree, with this garden planted and carefully nurtured, and with the jewels your father gave your mother as a token of his love." At this, Cinderella's tears began to flow faster. The realization that someone knew of her humiliation and her trials, and that she was not entirely alone, was such a relief that she could not stop herself from weeping quietly. The apparition smiled sweetly. "My dear," she said, "dry your tears. I am here to bring you gifts." Stepping, or rather floating, aside, she motioned toward the branches of the hazel tree. Cinderella could scarcely believe her eyes. Hanging from its branches was the most beautiful dress she had ever seen. It was gold in color, glimmering subtly from top to bottom. The voluminous skirt floated gently in the wind, flashing and sparkling in the darkening late afternoon. On the ground lay 2 dainty matching slippers, and hanging from a nearby branch was one of her mother's necklaces, a delicate piece made of diamond and topaz. This final detail confounded Cinderella, for she had believed that her mother's topaz necklace had been buried with her. There was no time to question it now. Cinderella jumped to her feet, whispering her gratitude, and almost afraid to touch the beautiful garment before her. Then her face fell. "But how will I get there?" she asked. "I don't know the way, and our carriage is in disrepair for such a long journey." The lady smiled and told her not to worry. She would manage everything. With a gentle wave of her hand, Cinderella suddenly found herself wearing the dress and exquisite slippers. Best of all, she could feel the weight of the topaz necklace around her neck. She placed her hands gently upon the jewels, then reached up to touch her hair, now magically arranged in a lovely mass of curls. Exuberantly, she spun in a circle, watching the dress rise around her like a feather in the wind. She was glowing, inside and out. The apparition smiled appreciatively at the results of her work, then flicked her hand toward the vegetable garden, where two squirrels were examining an enormous pumpkin. Instantly, a fine coach stood in the driveway, drawn by two tall, chestnut-colored horses. They whinnied softly, as if surprised to find themselves there. Cinderella gasped with delight. Then she heard a quick bark and turned to see that Henry was gone. In his place stood a diminutive coachman dressed in fine livery. He grinned at her like an old friend and bowed ceremoniously, gesturing for her to step into the carriage. Cinderella clapped her hands over her mouth in astonished delight. Henry would be driving her to the royal ball. Spinning around to face her benefactress, she thanked the lady profusely and asked how she could ever repay her. The shimmering vision laughed sweetly. "My darling," she said, "I am your godmother. It is my job to make you happy. This will be a beautiful night, but you must heed my words carefully. At the stroke of midnight, all of this magic will vanish. The carriage will once again be a pumpkin. The horses will return to squirrels. The coachman will regain his canine shape, and your beautiful dress will be replaced by your rags. You must be home before midnight, or you will be in great trouble." Cinderella nodded solemnly. She would not forget, and so her adventure began. The household returned to its daily routine, but the boredom was not to last for long. A few days later, another invitation arrived. It seemed that the royal family had decided to throw a second ball, and all the ladies of the house were once again invited. This threw Agnes and Imogen into a fair tizzy, and the dressmaker was summoned once again. Another section of Malcolm's library disappeared, and new gowns were ordered. After all, Lydia said over dinner, a young lady could not be seen twice in the same gown at consecutive royal balls. The dance was to be held in a week's time, and as the earliest days of winter settled upon the household, the mood was festive. On their social visits around town, Agnes and Imogen had heard the rumor that the prince was hoping to once again attract the dazzling young lady who had so intrigued him on the last occasion. Naturally, the two awkward sisters hoped that she wouldn't appear this time, so they could have another chance at meeting the prince. However, there were always other gentlemen who would be present, and as their mother pointed out, that was of great value to them. Secretly, Cinderella was torn, and she became a bit clumsy with her chores from her daydreaming. On one hand, she couldn't help hoping that her magical fairy godmother would turn up again and produce the beautiful dress and the coach for a second time. However, the practical side of the girl wanted to guard her heart from disappointment. She resolved to assume that she would not be granted that gift a second time. Once was good enough, she told herself. Once was enough, but she dreamed of dancing at night. The day of the second ball finally arrived. Lydia had trespassed upon the kindness of yet another neighbor and borrowed a passable carriage. Meanwhile, Agnes and Imogen were more demanding than ever. Cinderella was required to starch their crinoline until they practically stood up on their own. She was ordered to curl and arrange hair, to help with buttoning gowns. She had hardly a moment to dwell on what the night may or may not have held that would contribute to her own happiness. This time, as she watched the carriage with the other ladies pull away, she knew that she'd be heading straight for her bench in the garden. Henry trotted at her heels, and her shawl was pulled tightly around herself again, for the scent of the first snow was on the wind, and the cold was biting. Pushing open the gate, she felt some disappointment not to see her golden dress hanging on the tree once more. She chastised herself and perched on the stone bench, idly scratching Henry behind the ears. It had been too much to hope that her fairy godmother would make the magic happen a second time. Looking up at the sky, she tried to think positive thoughts. She closed her eyes and relived those breathless moments of gliding across the dance floor on that last perfect night. She felt the starry candlelight all around her. She felt the heat of the crowded room. She sensed the smoothness of the marble under her feet, and when she opened her eyes again, her astonishment knew no bounds. To her left, a shining silver gown glittered in the tree. Beneath it, a pair of lovely matching slippers balanced on the ground, and on an outer branch next to the dress hung a delicate silver and sapphire necklace. She was nearly certain, once again, that it was a treasure that had mysteriously come from her mother's box. She was sure she had seen it before. Turning her head, she saw with joy that her shimmering fairy godmother stood nearby. She smiled at Cinderella managing to be at the same time hardly visible and completely present. Her love and goodwill flooded the garden with a rosy glow that lifted the girl's spirits. With a small gasp, Cinderella realized she was about to have another adventure. Without a word, the apparition motioned again towards the pumpkin in the garden. Then she waved her other hand at two birds sitting in the hazel tree. Instantly, a coach stood in the driveway. It was even more magnificent than the rich brown one of the last ball. This carriage was black, lavishly trimmed with silver. In front of it, a team of powerful ebony horses stood, each wearing a feather atop its headdress. Once again, grinning as if sharing her delight, Henry stood dressed in a livery that matched the coach, waiting for his mistress to be ready. Bursting with happiness, Cinderella spun in a circle, knowing that the dress would be on her in a moment. As she completed her revolution, its icy silver layers floated down gently around her, as if enveloping her in a dream. She put her one white-gloved hand up to her neck and felt the weight of her mother's sapphire resting there, and her fingers touched the curls that cascaded elegantly about her head. She was ready, but her godmother had a warning to repeat. Dear girl, do not forget that this magic will expire at midnight. Do not lose your head and stay too long, or you will once again be revealed in your rags. Your coach will be a pumpkin fit only for the patch. Your horses and your coachmen will be birds and a dog. Keep your wits about you, and all will be well. Cinderella clasped her hands and nodded firmly. She promised her fairy godmother that she would not forget. Then she made haste, for she was thrilled with the promise of the evening to come, and she didn't want to lose a minute. Off the coach went, with the horses clip-clopping merrily down the road, pulling their darling Cinderella towards the royal ball once again. The night was overcast with the promise of snow, and the moon peeked out from the clouds only from time to time as the carriage sped towards the palace. White snowflakes began flying by the windows, visible in the light of the lamps at either end. It was a gentle snow, appearing with the lightest touch, as if to shyly introduce the winter once again. When the coach pulled up to the palace, the blazing lamps inside seemed even more festive than they had the last time. In contrast to the first bite of winter on the front steps, the entrance hall was a beacon of light. The darkness instantly melted away as guests crossed the threshold and were announced. Once again, Cinderella slipped by, briefly unnoticed. However, this was just barely, for her appearance in the entryway to the ballroom created an immediate stir. Decorum fell by the wayside when the ripple of excitement in the crowd reached the front of the room. This was where the royal family once again sat, presiding over the event. Forgetting his royal position, The prince involuntarily stood from his seat, his eyes burning a path across the crowd to the place where Cinderella stood. A silvery vision. Of course, she had no idea that she was the most beautiful woman in the room. She was, in fact, the most lovely girl anyone there could remember seeing. Not only was her gown even more magnificent than the one she had worn before, but there was something new and luminous in her. She radiated hope, self-confidence. She was suffused with a certain something nobody could put their finger on. It could only be described as magic. 1,000 whispers could be heard as the prince walked straight toward Cinderella, who stood fixed in place like a statue. Upon reaching her, he smiled from ear to ear and bowed down, saying, "May I have this dance?" She couldn't hide her expression of delight as she accepted his hand, and he whisked her onto the dance floor as if they were simply picking up where they had left off, resuming their dance from the night when she vanished after the stroke of 11. Cinderella felt as though her feet were not even touching the ground. In that moment, she hadn't a care in the world. Swept away by the music and the thrill of it all, she was brought back to reality only when the prince spoke to her. "We haven't actually been introduced," he said with a lopsided smile. "It's ridiculous, but I haven't even mentioned that my name is Edward." Cinderella had, in fact, known that his name was Edward. Everybody knew. What her mind was slowly registering, however, was that he was politely attempting to find out what her name was in exchange. Of course, she had mentally prepared for this unavoidable moment. If the gossip was true, he'd been eager to locate her a second time. In coming here, she'd resolved to somehow enjoy his company again without revealing her identity. Because truly, beyond the wrath she would experience from Lydia, what would he think of her if he found out who she really was? How could he possibly continue to see her, knowing of her humble position in a household that was fast ascending into debt? A fatherless girl with no fortune? No. She had vowed he would not discover her identity, and she would somehow avoid lying to him in the process. Smiling shyly, she looked down at her shimmering skirts, which floated around the pair as they danced in perfect time. Then, summoning a little bit of courage, she said, "I will tell you my name if you can guess what I call my little dog." At this, the prince laughed aloud. It was rare that any young lady had the courage to play such a game with him. Stepping with renewed vigor, he started trying out names. "Spot? Baxter? Captain?" he offered. She shook her head with a sly smile. "Well, is it a girl or boy?" he asked. "You must narrow it down for me." Cinderella cocked her head to the side as they swayed back and forth. She felt that it wouldn't hurt her subterfuge to offer him this concession. "He is a boy," she said primly. At this, Edward gained a comical look of concentration. Miles? Jasper? He continued, narrowing his eyes. Then he added, I feel quite sure you were the type to have a dog named Jasper. Smiling indulgently, Cinderella shook her head. You are wrong, she countered. I had an uncle named Jasper, and I found him quite dull. At this, the prince grinned once again and swung her faster in a circle. In that moment, she felt she had never been happier in her life. The riddle of her dog's name derailed Edward from pressing her for her identity. But she had another problem. Somehow, she had to create the notion that she might take a break on the veranda and still return to dance with him again. After she'd given him the slip at the last ball, he was anxious not to lose track of her a second time. How could she slip out later? More than once, she begged a few moments to rest, making sure she didn't leave the room during those times. While she sipped some punch or rested her feet, he was obligated to speak with other guests who clamored for his attention. When the clock struck 11, her heart sank. Just one more dance. Just 2 more dances, she told herself. There will be plenty of time. By 11:30, she knew she hadn't another moment to spare. She told Edward she would be taking a breath of air in the hallway. He regretfully turned to talk with other guests while she made her way into the tall, ceilinged foyer. Then, as quietly as a mouse, she slipped out the front door unnoticed. She made haste to her waiting carriage, where Henry tapped his foot impatiently. On her journey homeward, she saw that the world had become frosted with white, with snowflakes flying wildly around them. Henry urged the horses to travel faster as they moved quickly through the snowy countryside. He didn't need to say a word to his mistress. Cinderella knew that she had almost made a critical error by staying so late. She chided herself for her foolishness and hoped they would make it back before the stroke of midnight. The coach pulled up to a darkened house once again, and Cinderella had barely stepped to the ground when her entire carriage vanished. Suddenly, in her rags again, she turned to see Henry sitting next to the pumpkin. He barked at her as the 2 birds, once her beautiful ebony horses, flew off into the night. She stood still for a moment, catching her breath in the courtyard. It felt to her like everything was beginning to move too quickly. What had first been a fantasy for a single evening had turned into so much more. She realized with a sinking feeling that she had given herself over to the magic too much. She had allowed herself to hope for something better, for love, for another life. And now she couldn't take her heart back. She had already given it to Edward. Dragging the enormous pumpkin back to its place in the garden, she slowly made her way up to her room. Once there, she shut herself securely inside, lighting a warm fire in the hearth to comfort her. Donning her nightdress, she slowly climbed into bed. It was too dark to see the snow falling outside, but she fell asleep to the tip-tapping of the little ice crystals as they hit the window. In the darkness, she slept deeply and dreamed of dancing. The morning dawned with heavy, leaden skies. The world outside was coated in white, but to Cinderella, the monochrome landscape felt bleak rather than pretty. Her mood certainly matched the scenery. How could she face her real life after her enchanting second night with Edward? After the first ball, the prince had been more of an idea than an actual beau, but now he was first and foremost a handsome suitor who had a maddeningly attractive sense of humor as well. The thought that she would never see him again was almost more than she could bear. Agnes and Imogen were likewise in a dark mood. Not only had the mysterious woman once again monopolized the prince all night, but they had also failed to land any decent potential suitors. Making matters worse, the royal family was scheduled to leave soon, making progress to another county where they would spend the rest of the winter. The two pouting misses took out their lack of sleep and their frustrations on Cinderella. Petulantly demanding she complete all types of unusual tasks and scolding her when they were not done to their satisfaction. Of course, satisfying them would have been impossible. They were unfailingly contrary, and nothing would make them happy. That afternoon, while Lydia and her stepsisters were napping, Cinderella pulled on a heavy shawl and went outside. Standing in the middle of her garden, the fountain was silent and frozen, and the branches of the hazel tree were coated in ice. Closing her eyes, she wished fervently that her fairy godmother would appear and offer some kind of comfort to her. But try as she might, she was not able to conjure the kindly apparition. For the first time in her young life, Cinderella felt alone in the little courtyard that had once been her sanctuary. As a gust of wind whipped up the snow from the ground, she wiped away a tear. What good had the magic been if it had all come to nothing? Retreating to the house, she took advantage of the peace and quiet. Falling into a heavy sleep on her bed, she awoke to a brighter day, feeling foggy. Lying there, staring up at the ceiling, Cinderella realized that it was her birthday. She was turning 18, and she was quite sure that nobody would even remember. She rolled over and looked at Henry, happily wagging his tail by the door. "It's my birthday, Henry," she said. The dog whined quietly and stepped from foot to foot. Cinderella smiled at him indulgently. "You'll have to be my present today," she said, as she rose and straightened herself up. While standing at her mirror, she noticed there was a bit of a commotion in the hallway. Imogen was calling down the corridor to Agnes, and they were discussing something in high-pitched voices. Cautiously opening her door, Cinderella stuck her head out to see what was going on. Her stepsisters were standing with Lydia between them, huddled over a piece of paper. Sensing her presence, all three of them stopped talking and glared at her directly. Then Lydia said, "Cinderella, it's about time you made an appearance, you lazy girl. Be hasty with your morning chores, for your skills will be needed in the drawing room. There is to be a third ball in just 3 days, and there won't be time to order new gowns. You'll have to dress up the ones Agnes and Imogen already have." With that, the 3 women turned away and went rushing down the hall to chatter about plans and to pen a note begging another neighbor for the loan of their carriage. Cinderella stood frozen in the long hallway, filled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, another chance to see Prince Edward was the best birthday gift she could have asked for, one worthy of her fairy godmother. However, she also knew that she was perilously close to falling head over heels in love with a man who could never know her name. A man who surely wouldn't want to marry her if he knew the truth. Gazing down at her house dress and suddenly conscious of her messy hair, she imagined him arriving at their front door to meet her family. Then the image dissolved in her mind, because it was too improbable to conjure any further. Shaking her head, she pushed the ridiculous notion to the back of her thoughts and went downstairs to begin her labors in the kitchen. This was going to be a trying day, she thought. And of course, she was not wrong. As skillful as she was with a needle, she was not a magician. It would have taken the arts of her fairy godmother to create the impression that Agnes and Imogen had new dresses. She spent the afternoon with Lydia, barking orders, as she tied one piece of lace after another and pinned this or that ribbon differently. In the end, she was tasked with a series of alterations that would keep her quite busy until the ball. On the day of the ball, the entire household awoke to a heavy snowfall. And oh, how it was coming down. Worried that the roads would become impassable, Lydia bustled her daughters and their finery into the borrowed carriage once again, and set off for the home of an acquaintance in town. From there, it would be a much easier journey to reach the palace that night. Accordingly, Cinderella convinced Cook to leave early, so she might get home safely to her family. This left the girl alone, with just Henry for company. It was a relief to have her stepsisters out of the house, but the gray hours of the afternoon seemed to last forever. She felt quite alone on the estate, as the skies only grew darker while she waited. Curled up in the cocoon of her window seat, she got her thoughts in order. Yes, she decided, she would go to the ball, providing her fairy godmother appeared for her one final time. And yes, she continued, she would dance with Edward again. Blushing to herself, she was filled with joy to know, in her heart, that he would ask for her company again. And when the night was over, his family would leave the county. There would be no more reason for her to moon about. She would go on with her life and be grateful that she had met him and that she had been this happy for a little while. The only remaining problem was how to somehow conceal her identity a third time, deep in her heart. Cinderella knew she was fooling herself with all this well-intentioned resolve to move on. She knew that to see the prince again was to risk her heart. But she could not stay away. Pushing down any thoughts of the like, she stepped outside at dusk. The world was hushed, waited with the silence that only a heavy snowfall can bring. The flakes came down thickly all around her, coating her hair and her shoulders. Within moments, she watched the ground mesmerized as she made fresh tracks in the purest white snow behind her. Henry silently created a miniature trail of paw prints to parallel her own path. She opened the gate with some difficulty, breaking through the small drifts that had accumulated around it. Then, feeling confident in the existence of the magic, she stood still and made no sound. She didn't even take a breath. She simply waited, closing her eyes and earnestly wishing for the enchantment to last one more night. It wasn't a sound or a light that made her open her eyes. Rather, she felt as if a million tiny crystals washed over her, and she knew that it was happening again. Opening her eyes, she gasped. For the gown that hung before her in the hazel tree was unlike any she had ever seen. If a person could collect the stars in the sky and weave them into a divine fabric, that's what her fairy godmother had done to conjure this dress. It wasn't silver. It was as if it was made of diamonds and light. The skirts were like gossamer, floating and shimmering with every small movement of the breeze. Two impossibly dainty, brilliant slippers stood on the ground beneath. They looked as if they were made of glass, an effect no mortal shoemaker could have created. And on the branch next to the gown, instead of a necklace, a modest little diamond tiara glittered like topaz and sapphire jewelry. Cinderella recognized it as a piece her mother had once worn on very special occasions. Her mother would be with her tonight. Overcome with gratitude, Cinderella turned to the ethereal benefactress once again, but her smile soon fell. How would she get to the ball? The weather had made the road nearly impassable. "Is it too late?" she asked the beautiful apparition. At this, her godmother gave a laugh so musical it almost sounded like chimes, and she shook her head, waving her hand in the general direction of the pumpkin, for it was now buried under the snow. She made a flourish. In seconds, a handsome sleigh had appeared in the drive. Then, as a furry white rabbit hopped across the garden, her godmother waved the other hand. Instantly, it had disappeared, and a beautiful white horse stood hitched to the sleigh instead. And of course, Henry followed moments after in his transformation. This time, he'd be driving her to the ball in high style, on metal runners that flew across the ice and snow. Hardly able to contain herself, Cinderella turned in a circle, knowing that she would soon be dressed in the delicate, starry gown. And she was. But even as she sensed the skirts settling around her, she was also aware of a luxurious velvet cloak that covered her. It protected her perfectly styled curls with a capacious hood and sheltered her from the ice and snow. The little tiara sparkled elegantly in her hair. Henry helped her into the cushioned back seat of the silver and red sleigh, and then took up his position in the front. Cinderella turned to her godmother with happy gratitude. She was not surprised to receive the familiar reminder about being home by midnight. "This will be a beautiful evening," her godmother said. But then, more sternly, she urged, "Do not test the limits of the magic. The midnight hour is still the moment of its expiration. If you stay too long, you'll find yourself in a mess. Be sensible, and all will be well." Eager to be off, Cinderella issued a solemn promise to be responsible. Their swift progress towards the third and final royal ball was dreamlike. The weather was unrelenting, dropping a heavy curtain of white all around the speeding sleigh. However, in contrast to the rumbling and bouncing of the carriage, the sleigh made Cinderella feel like she was flying. Wrapped inside her protective coat, safe from the elements, she watched the ghostly landscape glide by. It was otherworldly. Despite how quick the journey was, her arrival could not come soon enough. She was acutely aware that this would be the last time, that these would be her last dances and smiles with Edward. She was simultaneously eager to begin the evening and loath for the inevitable end of it to approach. When her sleigh pulled up to the front steps, the footman at the door seemed impressed, pulling himself up a little taller. The man who helped her down forgot his usual deferential pose and looked up at her with open admiration. Even hidden under her cloak as she was, her arrival made a stir as she gingerly made her way up the steps to the front door. Another servant bowed low, motioning her inside. This time, coats and capes were being taken from the guests and whisked away to a nearby room. The visitors were then introduced. Once the ladies had been given an opportunity to rearrange their garments and their hair, Cinderella took careful note of the location of the cloakroom. Then she stepped into the shadows near the ballroom entrance, shifted as she swept in behind another family who had just been announced. Breathing a sigh of relief, she stood to one side and looked around, trying to get her bearings. Yet it was impossible for her to remain unnoticed. An audible gasp rippled through the room as the other guests took in her astounding beauty. Amid all the fine silks, heavy velvets and demure ribbons and laces, her gown was truly a sight to behold, and she glowed from within. Cinderella turned uncertainly and nodded politely to the people staring at her on either side. Thankfully, she was rescued by Edward, who appeared star-struck before her. Bowing low, he invited her to dance. If previous dances had been invigorating, delightful, or enchanting, this one was like a spell. At first, they swayed through the steps with their eyes locked. Not a word passed between them. It was as if a magnet drew them together. Their embrace was decorous, yet inseparable. When the dance ended, there was no question of changing partners. The prince would have no other. With gentle curiosity, Edward asked why she kept leaving so unexpectedly, without offering an explanation. Cinderella had anticipated the question and knew evasiveness was her only option. Falling back on the privilege of a lady's privacy, she apologized for the inconvenience and said she had been called away at the last moment. Edward accepted the answer, and they returned to dancing in silence, but not before he impulsively said, "I do believe you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen." Cinderella blushed deeply, unable to hide her pleasure at his words. Looking back steadily into his kind eyes and handsome smile, she replied that he looked very fine himself. Together, they danced on, oblivious to the rest of the company. After a time, Edward asked when she would tell him her name. She replied that since he was not good at guessing, she would tell him what she called her little dog, and that he would learn her name if he asked her after midnight. Playing along, he said, "Well then, let's have it. What is your dog's name?" "It's Henry," she said decisively. "Well," he replied with a skeptical look, "I must say, I think Jasper would be better." They both laughed, and he whirled her faster around the room. Soon he spoke again. "You must tell me something about yourself. Do you play the piano at all?" Cinderella shook her head. "I'm afraid any man who wishes to hear the piano in my company must play it himself," she responded gravely. This did not seem to bother the prince in the least. He asked another question. "Is there any type of book you like to read?" At this, Cinderella brightened. "Yes, I love to read. My father has, or had, quite a collection of books. I like histories, poetry, well, everything, really." The prince smiled broadly. "I do love histories," he said. "I'm intrigued by stories of the world. I wish I could go adventuring, but—" He cocked his head toward his mother and father, seated in their grand chairs. "I am not really afforded that freedom right now." Cinderella nodded sympathetically, and they continued their turns around the room. Then, wistfully, Edward asked her to tell him just one more thing about herself. Anything at all. After pondering the question for a moment, she replied softly, Last week was my 18th birthday. Edward brightened and wished her a very happy birthday. Butterflies fluttered in Cinderella's stomach, and she looked down, pretending to concentrate on her footwork. They both wished the night would never end, but end it must. At last, the moment came when Cinderella knew she would have to break her own heart by making her secret departure. She told Edward she was going to take some air in the foyer, as the outdoor balcony was buried in snow. Her plan had been to slip into the cloakroom, but an unexpected obstacle appeared in the form of Agnes, who seemed intent on pursuing the company of a young gentleman. The awkward pair stood directly in front of the door. As the minutes ticked by, Cinderella lingered in the foyer. She waved to Edward across the ballroom, fanning her face as though she were still too warm. Finally, several minutes after the clock had struck 11:30, Agnes released her hold on the helpless gentleman and returned to the ballroom. He hastily walked away, and Cinderella seized her chance. Slipping through the door, she located her cloak, pulled it around her head, and glided calmly toward the front entrance. Henry waited at the foot of the stairs beside the sleigh. Cinderella quickened her step, but halfway down the stairs, she lost her footing. One of her delicate slippers slipped from her foot and lodged in the deepening snow. As the footmen cried out to assist her, she knew she had no time to stop. Leaving the precious slipper behind, she hurried to the sleigh and climbed inside, her cloak and skirts ballooning behind her. Quick as a rabbit, the white horse leapt forward, pulling the sleigh smoothly away from the palace. Cinderella dared one final glance into the darkness behind her. The footmen stood on the steps, holding her shoe in a state of commotion. For the third time, she had escaped the ball without explanation. This time, just barely. During the swift journey home, the snow finally ceased, and the moon emerged from behind the clouds. The eerily beautiful landscape lay unnaturally still, as though urging the sleigh onward. Hills and snow-covered trees whispered, "Do not delay." At last, Cinderella and Henry nearly reached the front door, but not quite. At the gates of the estate, the sleigh vanished. Cinderella tumbled into a snowdrift. Dazed, she pulled herself up just in time to see a white rabbit dart across the moonlit lawn. Henry sat nearby, shaking ice from his coat. Cinderella sat in the wet snow, oblivious to the cold. She looked at the fat pumpkin, then rose unsteadily to her feet, leaving the heavy gourd by the gate. Only after trudging up the drive and climbing the front steps did she realize something was wrong. Her cloak was gone. Her clothes were once again rags. The tiara had vanished, but one slipper still clung to her left foot. In amazement, she removed it and balanced the sparkling shoe in her palm. She did not understand how it had remained, but she knew she would treasure it and hide it well. Pushing her way into the dark house, Cinderella went straight to her room. and pulled the covers over her head. Within moments, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke the next morning to a brilliant winter wonderland outside her window. The storm had passed, and sunlight reflected off every surface, filling even the gloomiest corners of the old house with light. Cinderella dragged herself from bed and sat in her window seat, peering down at the front steps. Lydia and her stepsisters had somehow made it home in the early hours, though the silence in the hallway suggested the journey had been an exhausting one. Turning back into her nook, Cinderella's eyes fell upon the dainty slipper resting on her dressing table. What a wonder it was that the shoe remained. She wondered what flaw in the magic had allowed it to stay behind. Perhaps it was because she had lost its pair at the palace. Though she could not explain it, she smiled and tucked the slipper deep beneath the table. Henry wagged his tail sympathetically from the doorway. Cinderella knew she would carry memories of Edward with her for many days to come. But for now, she also knew the cook would soon need her help. Later that afternoon, her stepsisters finally rose and lounged in the parlor, gossiping loudly about the ball. As before, they complained bitterly about the mysterious lady who had danced all night with Prince Edward. "To think," Agnes scoffed, "we were there 3 times and never even got to meet him." Imogen sniffed in agreement, declaring it ridiculous, and adding that it was just as well he was leaving. As the county balls and dances were becoming quite tiresome, Cinderella shook her head to herself as she dusted the portraits in the corridor outside. She knew that her stepsisters were going to have to return to relying on country visits to other households in order to meet any young gentleman. Lydia was sure to be in a terrible mood. The warmth of the sun began to melt the snowdrifts that day, and by the time the household awakened the next morning, it seemed as though the world were coated in glass. Icicles hung from tree branches and from the eaves of the house. The snow was not as deep as it had been the day before, and the roads had become much more passable for horses and carriages. Nonetheless, accustomed as they were to isolation, the ladies were quite surprised to see a very richly appointed coach approaching the house in the late afternoon. Their curiosity turned to outright amazement when Prince Edward stepped out of the conveyance. He approached the house, followed by a hawk-looking footman who appeared to be carrying a sparkling slipper. Without understanding how Prince Edward's arrival was even possible, or speculating that a mistake might have been made, Agnes and Imogen rushed toward the mirror, tidying their hair and pinching their cheeks. There was no time to change their clothes. He was climbing the steps at that very moment. They hastily positioned themselves at the top of the stairs. On the way there, Imogen had the idea to make sure Cinderella was hidden away. Knowing that the key to Cinderella's own room had been confiscated by Lydia, Agnes pushed Cinderella into Imogen's chamber and pulled the door shut, locking it from the outside. Cinderella thumped at the door. She did not fully understand why she had been locked in, but she knew it had something to do with a surprise visitor. To be trapped in Imogen's messy chamber was an insult greater than she could quietly bear. Meanwhile, Lydia dragged the cook upstairs and bade her open the door, because she was the only person in the house who appeared to be a servant. Once that charade was complete, the prince's footman announced that they had come to visit the young lady in the house who was 18 years of age. They were, in fact, visiting every house in the county where an 18-year-old debutante lived. They were in search of the young lady who happened to be the owner of this unusual shoe. Saying this, the footman held up the slipper with a flourish. Standing behind Lydia on the stairs, Imogen's eyes widened. She knew it was not her shoe, but as she was the only visible 18-year-old lady in the house, she was determined to seize the opportunity. As Lydia swept aside, inviting the royal visitors in, Imogen sashayed front and center and dropped a comically low curtsy. Meanwhile, Agnes pouted on the stairs. It was outrageous that Imogen should be the one to get a chance at the prince. The footman looked sideways at Edward with an expression of skepticism. Likewise, Edward seemed crestfallen. This could not possibly be the ethereal creature he had fallen in love with over the past few weeks. Sensing his hesitation, Imogen took action. "Your Royal Highness," she began, her voice dripping with sweetness. "I am so grateful to you for bringing my slipper back. Regretfully, the other was lost in the storm on the way home last night. However, I'm quite sure this one is mine." The prince peered at her again, cocking an eyebrow. Lydia's smile froze on her face. Seeing that Edward was about to withdraw, she pressed him further. "Imogen is right about the sad loss of her other slipper. However, might she not try it on for you? I'm quite sure it will fit like a glove." At this, Agnes snorted from the stairway, earning herself a pointed look from her younger sister. Imogen's feet and hands were on the large side, and this slipper appeared to be quite petite. All three women were aware that getting Imogen's foot into it would be quite a task. Before the prince could object, Lydia motioned impatiently to the cook to bring a chair. Rolling her eyes, the weary woman fetched one from another room and placed it squarely in the middle of the foyer. Imogen seated herself with great airs, behaving as she supposed a great lady might. Then, summoning a bit of bravado, she lifted her foot and presented it to the royal servant, giving the prince another wry glance. The man politely knelt down and attempted to slip the shoe onto Imogen's foot. He wriggled it. He knocked it. He adjusted its position. Imogen attempted to assist him, twisting her ankle this way and that, furrowing her brow in concentration. Finally, by some miracle, she managed to jam her foot precariously inside. The shoe was bent and clearly did not suit her at all. Nonetheless, she saw a chance for victory. "See," she said brightly, "it's as if it were made for me." Then, covering her mouth in a false show of modesty, she added, "And of course it was. It's my slipper, mine." You can tell. Edward stood there, wordless. He looked as though he might feel unwell. But just then, there was an interruption that saved him from further unpleasantness. A little dog came running down the stairs, whining and dodging Agnes and her skirts. He leapt into the foyer, darted around Lydia, and sat in front of the prince with a shoe in his teeth. Edward's eyes widened with surprise, for it was the exact match he had been seeking. One by one, each woman in the hall widened her eyes and brought a hand to her mouth, replaying the ball in their minds. Lydia, Agnes, and Imogen realized the truth at the same moment. The mysterious girl had been none other than Cinderella. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. Imogen made a move to grab the slipper from the dog's mouth. "My shoe!" she cried, as if delighted, but the faithful pup would not relinquish his treasure. He dug his little feet into the rug and pulled backward. A comical tug-of-war ensued, and Agnes dissolved into a very inappropriate fit of laughter. Failing to seize the slipper, Imogen finally snapped, "Henry, let the slipper go." At last, it was in her hands, but it was too late. Edward had heard the name that his beloved called her little dog. Looking at Lydia with a piercing stare, he asked where the other 18-year-old lady of the house was. One would think that at this stage, the stepmother might have acknowledged Cinderella's presence and played the entire affair off as a misunderstanding. But Lydia was not ready to give up. She folded her arms and insisted that there was no other lady in the house, only a serving girl. "Then please summon the serving girl," Edward said. Spluttering with indignation, Lydia tried to make another excuse, but it was too late. Agnes had gone upstairs and unlocked the door to Imogen's room, and Cinderella appeared on the stairs above, dressed in her rags. One could say Agnes did this to spite Imogen. Or, if one were inclined to a sunnier view, one might say she had finally repented for treating Cinderella so poorly. Then again, it is often wise to ally oneself with a person who is about to become a princess. Whatever her reason, the important point is that it happened, and in doing so, Agnes became the final, improbable bit of magic that made Cinderella's dreams come true. The moment Edward spied Cinderella, a silent transformation swept over the foyer. The prince's face was radiant. Cinderella stood defiantly, finally ready to reveal herself. Lydia appeared to be composing herself in preparation for offering explanations. Imogen looked furious, while Agnes, standing on the landing with the key in her hand, seemed strangely at peace. The footman and the cook looked like two people who had just witnessed justice done, and they were plainly delighted. Henry broke the spell, bounding up the stairs to greet his mistress. The prince walked toward Cinderella as she descended, and soon the two of them stood like an island amid the confusion, their eyes locked together. Neither wished to be parted again. The cook made them comfortable in the parlor, and Lydia thought it best for the rest of them to withdraw, hoping the prince might overlook their dreadful behavior. When Cinderella shared the plain circumstances of her poverty with Edward, he was surprisingly unconcerned. "My parents certainly wish me to choose a wife who will be a suitable partner in my public life," he said. "But your circumstances are not your fault, and we do not need money from your family. If you can tolerate my terrible taste in dog names, I would very much love it if you would agree to be my wife." Of course, she said yes, because she loved him. Having gained her acceptance, Edward suddenly furrowed his brow. "There is something wrong," he admitted. "You still have not told me your name. How incredible that I proposed to you without even knowing it," she smiled. "My stepsisters and stepmother call me Cinderella, but I would much prefer that you call me by the name my parents gave me, Arabella." Edward smiled, for he finally knew the name of the woman who had captured his heart. Later that week, Arabella gathered Henry and her few possessions and was whisked away to the palace, where an army of servants helped her prepare for her nuptials. Before she departed, Arabella returned one last time to her mother's garden. There, she uncovered her mother's box of jewels. Everything lay exactly as it had been left: the topaz, the sapphire, the tiara, and her mother's wedding ring. This last, she decided, she would wear when she married. A few weeks later, as Arabella discussed her wedding dress with the seamstresses, Edward entered the drawing room with a look of great excitement. Stepping aside, he revealed Malcolm. Father and daughter rushed into each other's arms, overjoyed. Malcolm explained how his expedition had gone astray and become stranded, with no means of sending word home. Edward had hired men to track him down and bring him back, a gift beyond price. Malcolm praised Arabella for all she had endured and expressed regret that Lydia had allowed such burdens to fall upon her. As for Lydia and her daughters, Arabella chose mercy. She offered Agnes and Imogen positions at the palace, though not in her personal entourage. Both accepted, hoping for a kinder life. And so Cinderella laid her past resentments to rest. No fairy tale is complete without a glimpse of its happy ending. Arabella and her prince were married in a glittering ceremony, and afterward they traveled throughout the kingdom, winning hearts wherever they went. Edward grew close to Malcolm, and Arabella was happier than she had ever been. As for her fairy godmother, Arabella always sensed her presence, like a whisper on the wind or a gentle harmony in an empty room. She never felt alone, and thus Cinderella and her prince lived, most certainly and without a doubt, happily ever after.